Now, you may decide to do a qualitative study, so the data that you collect will be a little bit different, and what you do with that data is going to be a little bit different as well. So, qualitative and quantitative research can be used to answer the same types of questions. Both of them can be used to describe, explain, predict, or control, but they do have their strengths. Qualitative and quantitative both have their strengths in the style of research you wish to conduct, and they also have a couple of assumptions about the sort of questions you can ask and how analyses can be performed. So I want to go through some of the differences between qualitative and quantitative research first to put qualitative research in perspective, because quantitative research is typically how research is described and understood. So let's take a quick look at that. So I've made a table here comparing quantitative and qualitative research, just a couple of key differences. So obviously the definition of quantitative is to take data and transform it into numbers or transform it quantitatively or numerically, whereas qualitative research won't attempt to transform observations or experiences or events into numbers that can be analyzed statistically or quantitatively. They're kept in whole chunks. And so if you think of like an experience that you've had, like a birthday party that you went to, the birthday party would be one big chunk, and you can understand the chunk by analyzing it using qualitative methods, as opposed to it can be described in a bunch of different quantitative ways. How many hours it was, how many people were there, how many pounds of cake were consumed, or gifts, how many dollars of gifts were given, and so on. So a very different way of breaking something down. Well, quantitative breaks it down into numbers or values. Qualitative tries to keep the whole unit intact. In quantitative research, the analysis portion, so once the data has been collected, it's analyzed numerically, famously statistically, but also just counting or collating numbers, combining numbers, creating equations to test numbers, or to test values or to assess values. Those are quantitative analytic approaches, very clean and tidy. Qualitative approaches require the use of a human science method, and so those are a little bit different from quantitative methods or statistical methods. And so I'll go through some of those analytic methods, but there are steps to follow, and there are ways to do qualitative research rigorously. Quantitative research is typically referred to as objective, and by objective I mean third-person verifiable. So if one person can make an observation, and that observation is systematic, and usually there's some tool used to quantify the observation, and then someone else could come in, use the same tool, and get the same observation. Therefore, it doesn't matter who made the observation, it's third-person verifiable, it's objective. Now, subjective, which I've put in the qualitative column here, subjective data or subjective information comes from a person's point of view, and we don't try to extract the observation from the point of view. We accept that observations will come from a perspective and that perspective should be honored. So, in classroom research, qualitative data collection and analysis is going to be more empowering to the people we're analyzing. So if we're interested in student experience or helping students learn or achieve whatever objectives they're after or their well-being, we're taking seriously their perspective. We're not saying, well, it doesn't matter what student, it just matters that we have so many students and we can average across all of them. So the students, individual students are kind of irrelevant, we just want a big number. I've also put interpretative and critical. So interpretative means it's open to the interpretation of the researcher and whoever else is involved. Sometimes the participants are involved in that interpretive process. But qualitative research accepts that part of the analysis is going to be coming up with an interpretation. So we're not looking at things the way they are, our perception is transforming that. Now that happens in objective research too, but the design of objective research tends to minimize or ignore subjectivity in the process of interpretation. A famous book by Michael Polanyi called Personal Knowledge examines so-called quantitative or objective research. So you can look into that if you're interested. And then I put in both columns, research can be used to describe, explain, predict, and control. Now, I would say qualitative strength is in description, really understanding what's going on. Quantitative research has the advantage in making predictions, because predictions need to be systematic, and you would need to adhere to like rigorous observational guidelines and a formal analytic process that can be controlled, and the experiment is ideal for that. Now, you can do that in a qualitative study, but if you're making a prediction and you're relying on your interpretation of the data, it just makes it really easy to see what you expect to see, and then your analysis is just you drawing the conclusion that you expected all along. That's why it's important to follow a method if you're going to do qualitative research. Now, I'm a qualitative researcher. I primarily do or collect qualitative data and analyze it because I typically find quantitative methods to be too constraining. It's too easy to presuppose the phenomenon I'm interested in. So like student learning, well, we have to have, in quantitative research, you have to have the definition of it. And the definition is usually quantitatively developed. And so like it's like you have these categories that you need to determine ahead of time before you even talk to students. And then you try to fit what they say into the right categories. I prefer to start without any categories and presuppose nothing and kind of start off in a naive framework. I have lots of experience and knowledge, but I want to set that aside and meet my participants as people with a perspective that's valid and valuable, and then go from there. So let's take a look at some of those methods. Oh, excuse me. Now we need to collect data. You can collect qualitative data by journaling, by like making observations or naturalistic observations and keeping a journal. So a lot of ethnographic work is done that way. You can videotape something, do observations that way. Typically, though, actually, I've heard of qualitative research that just examines voices, like sounds that people make. A really interesting psychiatric diagnosis procedure was developed, and the name of the person who did that I forget. But what you're doing is relying on observations of complete events and then analyzing it using one of the methods. Typically what you'll do is conduct interviews with your participants, the people you're interested in understanding better or studying. And so there are 3 types of interviews that you can conduct. I'll describe them briefly. There's the structured interview, which has, say, 5 or 10 questions, and you follow the questions one by one. You start with the first question, they respond, you go to the next question, they respond, and it just goes back and forth like that until the interview questions have concluded, and then you stop recording, you transcribe the interviews, and that's your data. Now, you have to have pretty good questions to do a structured interview. You have to really know what sort of answers you're going to get and know your subjects very well, your participants very well. Most qualitative research prefer a semi-structured approach, which is they might start off with 5 questions, all of which are organized around the topic in question. And then they'd go through the question, they'd ask question 1, and then if the response goes in a direction they didn't expect, they'll follow the participant that direction. They won't say, oh, well, we're going to move on in the direction of the interview. They follow the participant or the interviewee. And so semi-structured interviews allow the researcher or the qualitative researcher to follow new directions that were unanticipated or unexpected, and follow them to see where they lead. And the more practice you get, the easier it is to be sensitive to your participants when they answer a question or they misunderstand a question, and in their misunderstanding, you realize something new about your topic that you hadn't anticipated. And then finally, I'm sure you can imagine, unstructured interviews go a step further, and they have like this general topic, and then they just have a conversation. So like if you're interested in student motivation, you might just have one general topic. I want to know what you like or don't like about the learning process, what gets you excited, what makes you bored. Can you think of an experience to tell me about? Or you just open up the floor. I'd like to have a conversation with you about motivation. Here's the definition I'm using. Does anything come to mind? And you just let the participant lead the discussion, and you just do your best to kind of pick out things that are interesting to you that you want to hear more about. So those are the three forms of interviews. I almost always do semi-structured interviews, and the more interviews I conduct in a study, I may start to skip questions if I realize that, okay, I totally missed the point of that question, or maybe I'll adjust it based on what other people are saying. And so I feel like my interview skills improve within each study the more interviews that I do. Of course, during the IRB process, the Ethical Review Board, you'll have to identify what sort of interviews you'll be conducting, what questions you use, and how you plan on modifying them if it's semi-structured. So, for example, I'll say, here are my list of questions, and I plan on following my participants or respondees. I'm going to follow their guidance. I'm going to follow their direction and adjust questions as necessary. That seems to satisfy most IRBs. All right. So you conduct interviews. You transcribe them. Maybe you used an AI program to help you with that process, or hired somebody to help you with the transcription. But now you've got sheets of paper, maybe like 10 pages or 20 pages or 100 pages, depending on how many interviews you've conducted, of interview content. And now you have to go through and analyze it. So I've listed 5-6 different analytic methods, and you can read books about each of these. In fact, you can read books about each of these in teacher education, I suspect. I'm familiar with phenomenology in education, narrative analysis, critical discourse analysis, participatory action. I don't know, I haven't read any ethnography or autoethnography, but definitely the other four, I'm sure autoethnography and ethnography have been done in education studies. So phenomenology, all of these belong to a philosophical school, most of which are rooted in the late 19th century or into the middle of the 20th century and are still very popular today. Phenomenology comes from Edmund Husserl and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Martin Heidegger, and others in continental Europe, and they look at the structure that experience has. And so the word phenomenology is the study of the world as it presents itself to us, or as it presents itself to a person. It's often examining those things that we can't quite put into words, these whole structures. It's not easy to break them down into their smallest parts. We need to keep the whole experience together. I have done I do a lot of phenomenological analysis, but one of them was a study of first-generation college students, and I wanted to know what it was like to be a college student with this identity, and how that identity, or how one encountered college through that identity. I didn't want to ask questions to verify that they're first-generation college students. I didn't want to test outcomes and do like a correlation. I just wanted to know what it was like for them as a college student and see what the structure of that experience looked like. And I did it with enough students and got a sense of, all right, they all seem to follow the same structure. And then in a phenomenological analysis, you make that structure as clear as possible, and then kind of test it to see how far you can bend it one way or the other, and then what you're left with is the structure of that experience. Narrative analysis follows the human phenomenon of telling stories that have a specific structure. In Western culture, we like the underdog story, for example. So the underdog story is the hero is weak or powerless or looked down upon, but then has a challenge that looks like they're not capable of succeeding, and then they succeed. And so it's like it has a narrative arc where you start maybe here when you meet the hero, and then things get bad, and then there's an opportunity to win, and then there's a failure, and then there's the win, and we're like so excited about the underdog story. But we also have the story of, the star-crossed lovers. Someone makes a decision to get what they want, and it ends up violating something essential to being human, and then they learn from their mistake, and then they get what they want. Like, there are these narrative structures to narrative structure to stories that we tell. But then when we interpret our own lives, we must, because we're human, we must interpret them through some storyline. Wait, am I a hero, or am I the villain? Or am I in need of rescuing? Or am I the rescuer? So there are all these different roles that we play, and we can interpret a story based on the roles we imagine ourselves playing and others playing. Narrative analysis looks at the structure of the stories we tell about something in particular. So it could be having a remarkable learning experience. Does that always follow the same storyline, or is there a set of stories that humans tend to tell about having a remarkable learning experience, or having a good teacher, or being motivated? So we can look at the different structures of the stories that we tell about something. Critical discourse analysis looks at conversations that we have. So discourse analysis is the study of conversation or discourse. So it might be breaking down sentences to see what work is being accomplished using those sentences. And one of the main points there is that when we speak, we're not only conveying information, we're also doing something with the type of words that we use and how we're responding to other people. An example, I think the word for that is called interpolation, if I'm not mistaken. But a good example that's given in that literature is when the minister pronounces a bride and groom, husband and wife, or husband and husband, or whoever's getting married, they're making a declarative statement, but there's also power behind it, because there needs to be certification, state level or national level certification, to declare some people's spouses. But and there's also the statement that they are spouses. So there's more going on than just the words being used. So critical discourse analysts examine conversation and discourse, looking for who's exerting power over whom, and what are the expectations about that power, how is power yielded, how is power used. So oftentimes critical discourse analysis might examine traditional education, looking for racist undertones or sexist undertones. Whose voice is missing? Whose voice is present? What does that say about expectations and potential and possibility? So critical discourse analysis is looking for all of those things. Participatory action research, a little bit different than classroom action research. Action research in this framework is usually around like designing a program for community improvement. For example, if I were to go to a local elementary school and I wanted to do participatory action research, well, the action research part would be, I want to improve some problem or resolve some problem. The participatory part, so that's the action. We're going to do something together. The participatory part means I'm not guiding it, I'm just there to co-facilitate it. So I would meet with the stakeholders. I'd meet with the teachers, I'd meet with the students, I'd meet with the principal, and together we would talk about the community there, the goals, what seems to be working well, what seems to be working poorly, and then together, and since I'm the researcher, I may be bringing expertise, but I'm by no means the leader. And so we would together, it'd be a collaborative effort. So participatory action research seeks to maybe make an improvement or address a problem by involving everybody, so it's more collaborative. And in that respect, it's liberatory and democratic. Finally, ethnography and autoethnography. These are common in, say, anthropology, so telling stories about civilizations throughout time, or even sociology, looking at the way that different social groups or demographics relate to each other, their cultural traditions. So it's like kind of watching and understanding the story from various perspectives and being able to not take anything for granted from the outside as an outsider, but try to understand a culture by living in the culture and appreciating it from the culture's perspective. As you can see, each of these approaches asks the researcher to let go of their own perspective, their own biases, and get to know either the person, the stories they tell, the power dynamics, the goals and aspirations of a group, or the culture of a group in question. So if you're interested in any one of those, just type in the word phenomenology or narrative analysis and elementary education and middle grades education. My guess is you'll find books and articles written specifically about those research methods, maybe with lots of examples in the area that you're interested in researching. That's it.